Hi comrades, thanks for asking me to speak today. I'm just looking out the window at some very welcome rain here in Australia that we've had in the last week. Thankfully, in the last few days, the majority of the bushfires have been either put out or brought under control finally, including one of the mega fires that has been blazing for 74 days straight. That's the Currawang mega fire, which, in case people don't know, is a fire that is formed by a series of fires coming together and forming one big mega fire. And that fire alone burned over an area the size of 8 times the size of Manhattan. As I'm sure people have read, something like 1 million hectares of land has burned over the last few months, since August, which is when the fire season began last year, which is around 2 months earlier than the fire season usually begins in Australia, and on an absolutely unprecedented scale. So we've had about over 30 people die. We've had thousands of homes destroyed, and those conditions were really created by the effects of climate change and what those effects have had on Australia. So in the last 4 years, we've had record-breaking temperatures year after year. In some places, that has meant towns experiencing temperatures of around 50 degrees Celsius for a series of days, and it's created the conditions in which the land is simply unmanageable. And the Australian government was actually warned for years about this, actually, by firefighters and climate and fire scientists, warning of the kind of catastrophic bushfire season that we've seen. And I think we're absolutely living with the consequences of our government's negligence over the last few months. It has been truly horrifying. I'm sure most of you have seen the semi-apocalyptic images that have been coming out of places like Malakuta on the Victorian coast, where people had to be evacuated by the Navy eventually. So as I said, the normal methods for prevention and management of land to make sure that the bushfires don't get out of hand, because we've always had bushfires in Australia. The conditions have meant that that's virtually been impossible. So, for example, doing backburning in order to reduce fuel loads, the window in which that has been possible has just narrowed and narrowed and narrowed over the last few years. And the drought that we've had some of the lowest levels of rainfall on record in the last decade. So much of the country has just dried up, and we've seen landscapes and ecosystems burning that have never burned before and are not bushfire adapted, and a lot of those ecosystems will never really recover. So wet rainforests, for example, and a lot of the species that live in those ecosystems will also not recover, unfortunately. And we've had about more than 1 billion animals die, and that doesn't count fish and invertebrate. Actually, it's been mostly marsupials, but the scale of the destruction has just been incredible. And yet the Liberal National Coalition government has continued, or tried as hard as they could, to deny the connection with climate change, the fact that it was driven by climate change. And it was only quite late into the piece that Prime Minister Scott Morrison had to admit the connection, after having denied it for months, and also having taken a holiday to Hawaii at the beginning of this bushfire season. But this undeniably climate change-driven disaster has been massively compounded by the Australian and the various state governments' cuts to things like the fire services, as well as the parks and wildlife services, who are actually capable of carrying out some of the preventative land management that would have meant that perhaps the fires would be slightly less severe than what they've been. And the vast majority of the firefighting has been done by volunteer firefighters, 5 of whom have died. died fighting the fires, as well as a number of professional firefighters, including some firefighters that came in from the US to help. But at this point, the government is trying to shift focus away, I think, from the question of climate change by now talking about building resilient communities, climate change mitigation, and so forth. And having dropped severely in the polls, Scott Morrison is now talking up his government's response to the fires. The fact that they sent in the army, they've now promised $2 billion in rescue and recovery. Although a lot of that, people are saying that doesn't go far enough. He was also forced to finally compensate some of the volunteer firefighters who had been fighting for months on end. But that has also been quite difficult for those firefighters to access that money. While there is an important question around mitigation and around land management, and a lot for climate activists and socialists to say around that issue and to fight for, the question really does come back to climate change. The conditions were absolutely created by global rise in temperatures, and Australia is a continent that is particularly vulnerable to the changes in the climate, as we've seen so brutally. But I think this shift by the government to focus on mitigation and resilience is really about obfuscating from their absolute unwillingness to confront the question of climate change and to cut our emissions, which are actually some of the highest in the world, the highest per capita certainly. In fact, the Australian government at the last international climate talks in Madrid, essentially tried to sabotage the talks by claiming that Australia should be able to carry over carbon credits from the Kyoto days, and this is despite the fact that our carbon emissions have actually continued to rise. But this is because in Australia the fossil fuel industry is very much hardwired into Australian capitalism. So for example, last year mining companies exported about $26 billion worth of coal, $49 billion worth of gas last year, and they want to actually extend that. They want to extend mining. They want to increase production of extraction of oil and gas as well, and we have a real fight in our hands to prevent that from happening. But also, while Australia is the 11th biggest economy in the world, it's around 90th in terms of the diversity of its profit base. So coal and fossil fuels is really deeply entrenched in Australian capitalism, and so in order to break with that, we do need to go right to the heart, actually, of Australian capitalism and of capitalism in general. So, in Australia, we've had some really inspiring mobilisations over the last year, particularly that of the high school climate strikers. We had some of the biggest protests since the Iraq War in September last year. It's September 20th. But the high school students also adopted a new demand at the last high school strike that put the question of a just transition front and centre. So actually calling for fossil fuel industry dependent communities to have a just transition for those workers to have guaranteed jobs as an outcome of transition, and so that's been a really positive development in Australia. But I think there's going to be a need to continue to put the question of jobs front and centre in our campaigns, and I think the the circumstances that I've explained to you in terms of the, just how central the fossil fuel industry is in Australia, ultimately, while we work alongside all sorts of other groups who want to see serious action on climate change and massive reduction in our extraordinarily high emissions, ultimately, in order to deal with the problem of climate change, we are going to have to confront the system as a whole, because I'm convinced that Australian capitalism, British capitalism, capitalism anywhere, is entirely unable to deal with the climate crisis that we face. And I think what we've seen in Australia over the last few months is really just a glimpse of what we could face in the future if we allow things to continue. So we will continue to build that movement throughout this year and in the years to come, and we stand with you in the UK and elsewhere in solidarity in building that struggle. Thanks very much.